In Berlin, the press hall of the Chancellery filled with quiet murmurs as journalists prepared for what many in Europe had been waiting to hear, a statement from the German leadership on the fragile but hopeful ceasefire developments between Israel and Hamas. The backdrop was the blue and gold of the German and European Union flags, symbols of unity and diplomacy. Cameras clicked and the tension in the room was palpable. Moments later, Chancellor Friedrich Merz entered, flanked by Finance Minister Lars Klingbeil, Labour Minister Bärbel Bass, and Bavarian State Premier Markus Söder. Their arrival signalled not just a routine briefing, but a moment of European reflection amid a war that had shaken the Middle East and divided world opinion. Merz took his seat at the centre of the long wooden table. His expression was grave but composed. For weeks, Germany had watched the escalating conflict in Gaza, the bombings, the humanitarian crisis, and the uncertain negotiations mediated by Washington, Doha, and Cairo. Now, as the cameras rolled, the Chancellor began to speak. His words were deliberate, each syllable carrying the weight of Germany's moral and political history. This development, Merz said, pausing briefly, towards a ceasefire and the release of hostages is encouraging. It offers a moment of hope in a time of immense tragedy. His tone was careful, not triumphant, not naive. Behind those words was a recognition that every European capital, Berlin included, understood how fragile such moments could be. To his right, Lars Klingbeil nodded, his eyes fixed on the papers before him. The finance minister had been quietly coordinating Germany's humanitarian assistance for Gaza, overseeing aid packages that would reach the enclave once the guns fell silent. To his left, Bärbel Bass, the Labour minister, leaned forward slightly, one of the few in the government who had personally spoken with aid organisations describing the conditions on the ground. Merz continued, emphasising Germany's dual commitment to Israel's security and to the protection of civilian lives in Gaza. Our solidarity with Israel remains unshakable, he said. But our responsibility as Germans, as Europeans, and as human beings compels us to advocate for humanitarian relief and for a path that leads back to dialogue. The journalists scribbled furiously. These words were not new in form, but they carried a distinct shift in tone, a signal that Berlin was aligning with growing calls within Europe for a balanced approach. In Paris, President Macron had spoken the day before about a diplomatic duty to push both sides toward restraint. In Brussels, EU Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell had urged an immediate truce for humanitarian access. And now, in Berlin, the tone was unmistakably similar. Europe was recalibrating its language on the conflict. As Merz paused, Söder leaned toward the microphone, his trademark Bavarian firmness coming through. We must remember, he said, that behind every headline there are lives, families torn apart, communities destroyed. Germany will not be silent in the face of suffering. His remarks reflected not only empathy, but also a growing unease among German voters, many of whom had marched in cities like Munich, Hamburg, and Berlin, demanding a ceasefire. The Labour minister, Bärbel Bass, followed. Her focus was on workers, humanitarian organisations, and the volunteers who would soon be mobilised to deliver aid to Gaza. When the ceasefire takes hold, she said, Germany will act swiftly to support reconstruction and humanitarian recovery. Our NGOs are ready. Our people are ready. Her statement underscored a readiness to translate political will into tangible relief. As the press conference continued, the tone shifted toward Germany's diplomatic coordination with Washington. The Chancellor acknowledged the role of US President Donald Trump and Secretary of State Marco Rubio in brokering what was now being described as a phased ceasefire and hostage exchange plan. We recognize the significant efforts made by our partners in Washington, Merz said, and we will continue to support all steps that bring the parties closer to peace and stability. Behind this official language, however, there was an undercurrent of caution. German diplomats had privately expressed doubts about the durability of the Trump-brokered deal. They feared that without a clear political roadmap, one addressing Gaza's governance, reconstruction, and Israel's long-term security concerns, the ceasefire might not hold. Merz's press team later clarified that Germany was prepared to contribute financially to a post-conflict stabilization fund for Gaza, similar to the European pledges that followed past wars. Yet, unlike in previous years, there was now a stronger insistence on accountability. Aid cannot flow into a vacuum, Klingbeil explained. It must serve peace, not perpetuate cycles of destruction. Throughout the room, journalists pressed with questions about Hamas's role, Israel's response, and the broader implications for European diplomacy. Merz, who had once been criticized for his limited international experience compared to predecessors like Angela Merkel, handled the questions with a balance of empathy and resolve. He drew on Germany's own post-war lessons, reminding the room that peace was never achieved by military means alone. Reconstruction, he said, is not only about rebuilding homes. It is about rebuilding trust between peoples, between generations. The words resonated deeply, invoking a subtle but unmistakable parallel to Germany's own recovery from the ashes of war. As the press conference concluded, the ministers stood together, a tableau of unity. Merz, Söder, Baas and Klingbeil shook hands briefly before exiting the hall. The cameras followed them as they walked through the corridor lined with flags, their silhouettes fading into the bright afternoon light streaming through the chancellery windows. Outside, Berlin was calm, but the world beyond was anything but. In Gaza, the humanitarian machinery was being set in motion, aid trucks readied at the Rafah crossing, doctors preparing field hospitals, and UN convoys mapping safe zones. In Israel, families of hostages clung to the hope that the New Deal would finally bring their loved ones home. Germany's role, while modest, had been pivotal in shaping Europe's unified position. Over the past week, Berlin had coordinated closely with Paris and Brussels to ensure that the EU spoke with one voice, urging restraint, humanitarian access, and long-term political engagement. It was an approach that echoed through every European capital, signalling a continent reasserting its diplomatic identity. For Friedrich Merz, the moment carried personal stakes. As Germany's first conservative chancellor since Merkel, his leadership was under scrutiny, particularly on foreign policy. The Gaza crisis had tested his ability to navigate between moral clarity and geopolitical pragmatism. His response today suggested a maturing statesman, aware of history but attuned to the present. In private briefings, aides described Merz as deeply concerned about the humanitarian situation in Gaza. Though a staunch supporter of Israel's right to self-defense, he was reportedly moved by reports of civilian casualties and the toll on children. His remarks about encouraging developments were therefore not simply diplomatic phrasing. They reflected cautious optimism grounded in empathy. Later in the day, European broadcasters replayed the highlights of the Berlin press conference. The words encouraging and responsibility dominated headlines. Editorials across German newspapers noted that Merz had struck the right balance, supportive of Israel, yet mindful of the humanitarian imperative. In Munich, Markus Söder's comments resonated particularly with his conservative base, many of whom have traditionally viewed Israel as a key democratic ally. But even among them, there was growing recognition that the scale of the suffering in Gaza required a moral response beyond politics. Meanwhile, Lars Klingbeil's mention of targeted reconstruction aid drew praise from economists and NGOs alike. Germany's development agencies were already in contact with counterparts in Egypt and Jordan to coordinate logistics. Plans were being drafted to dispatch technical teams to assess infrastructure damage once conditions permitted safe access. Bärbel Baas, for her part, continued to work with labor unions and humanitarian groups to prepare Germany's contribution to civilian relief operations. Her focus was clear, ensuring that aid reached those most in need, women, children, and displaced families. The press conference ended as it began, with images that spoke as loudly as the words. The slow pan of cameras capturing Merz and his ministers rising from their seats symbolized both closure and continuity. It was a gesture that reflected Germany's place in this complex moment, neither a central broker like the United States nor a detached observer, but a steady, moral voice within the chorus of international diplomacy. As the ministers left, one journalist called out, "Herr Bundeskanzler, do you believe this ceasefire will last?" Merz turned briefly, his expression thoughtful. "Hope must always guide action," he said simply, before walking away. That sentence, understated yet profound, captured the essence of the day. Hope, not as a political slogan, but as a moral compass. By nightfall, Berlin's skyline shimmered under the autumn haze. News channels carried live updates from Tel Aviv, Doha, and Washington. Analysts debated the durability of the Trump-brokered plan, while others reflected on Europe's re-emerging diplomatic weight. In this shifting global landscape, Germany, under Friedrich Merz, had found its tone, pragmatic, empathetic, and quietly assertive. The day's images, Merz's calm posture, Söder's stern expression, Baas's compassionate words, Klingbeil's pragmatic assurance, together painted the portrait of a government seeking balance in a world of extremes. For millions watching, it was more than a press conference. It was a statement of intent that amid war and uncertainty, reason and humanity could still find their voice. That voice, from Berlin, carried across Europe and beyond, steady, measured, and above all, hopeful.
Ja, schönen guten Morgen und herzlich willkommen mit dem CDU-Vorsitzenden Bundeskanzler Friedrich Merz, mit dem CSU-Vorsitzenden Ministerpräsident Dr. Mack und Bundesministerin Bärbel Baas.